So what causes changes in retention or selectivity? I mentioned before adsorbed samples when it comes to the peak shape, because it can definitely have it manifest itself in peak shape, but things like biological samples, in particular blood samples, urine samples, biological samples like cell extracts where there's a lot of cell debris, or petroleum-based samples where there's all kinds of sticky components, things like that. These things tend to get stuck on the columns and can cause changes in retention and selectivity. And then the other section in this is chemical attack. So we'll go back to incompatible additives or solvents. Solvents, especially for our chiral columns, is a big thing to be aware of. And then either too high or too low pH mobile phases can cause issues with retention and selectivity as well. As far as method development goes, we're not going to talk about issues like scaling from smaller to larger particles or larger column dimensions. We're not going to talk about differences in instruments, and we're also not going to talk about method robustness. That's for another day, unfortunately. How can you diagnose these issues? Well, if it's absorbed samples, QCing the column, again, like we talked before with the plugged inlet fit, it's kind of the best way to go. Occasionally, you can open the column and actually inspect the CSP and see very clearly that there's something that is adsorbed to the column. I'll show you a picture of that on the next slide. Not always recommended, especially if you're dealing with an analytical column or even a prep column for that matter, because you might open it up and cause another problem that you weren't expecting. But sometimes it's very obvious that there's an issue going on. And then for chemical attack, oftentimes the incompatible solvents or the too high or too low pH, you will actually end up seeing some kind of a white powdery solid exiting the column. And that's either the silica gel that has degraded and is now coming out, or it's the polymer that has eluded and been dissolved off the surface of the silica gel. And that is one of those issues that is unique to our chiral columns, something that you should be very, very aware of. And I'll talk about solving compatibility in a couple of slides, but that is how you will that is how it will manifest itself. What are some things preemptively that you can do to avoid these issues with the adsorbed samples? Good sample cleanup again. Can't harp on that enough. Using guard columns, using inline filters kind of helps a little bit, but you will degrade those just as quickly as you will your chiral column if you're not cleaning your sample up well. So with the biological samples, you probably want to do a little bit more than just filtering it through a membrane. So you can use something like a solid phase extraction cartridge. If you have particularly sticky components that you might want to separate out, or just components that are kind of interfering with the chromatography, doing an achiral cleanup beforehand. You might even need to go into membrane filtration or some other kind of liquid extraction to remove those components that are causing some particularly negative effects. For chemical attack, make sure that you're developing methods with pHs that are higher than 2, but lower than 8 or 9, as long as you're using the correct buffer. So if you have a pH that is lower than 2, so 1, anything less than that, that will actually cause the ligands to cleave off of the surface. This is the same for achiral stationary phases as it is with our chiral columns. You can actually begin to cleave the polymer off of the surface of the silica gel. And if your pH is too high, so higher than 8 or 9, the conditions will actually begin to degrade the silica. And that is, again, the same for achiral or other chiral chromatography columns as it is with ours. Make sure that even if you are within the suggested pH range of 2 to 8 or 9, that you're not using harsh additives like HCl as an acidic additive, or harsh basic additives like sodium hydroxide. We would recommend that you use for acids something like TFA or formic acid or acetic acid. Much gentler on the column and much less likely to cleave the ligands or the polymer off the surface. And for bases, using an organic base like DEA or TEA if you're doing a normal phase or a polar organic method, or a buffered phosphate or bicarbonate system if you're doing reversed phase. Again, much gentler on the column, much less likely to begin degrading the silica as a result of the presence of that additive. And then the incompatible solvents. So for the coated CSPs, this is absolutely paramount that you avoid using things like dichloromethane, ethyl acetate, DMSO, THF, MTBE, and chloroform for all coated phases. And it is extremely important that if you're using a system that has both coated and immobilized columns on it, and you're planning on using any of these solvents on your immobilized columns, that you flush the system extremely, extremely well. In our case here in our lab, we actually have dedicated systems. We call them the extended range solvents. That would be hexane dichloromethane, hexane MTBE, things like that. That system never ever sees coated phases, just as the precaution so that there's never any chance whatsoever of those coated phases seeing these solvents. They are okay with the immobilized columns, but make sure absolutely that if you're going to use the same system that has these extended range solvents on them and you're going to use a coated phase at some point, that you flush very, very well. So make sure that you flush the HPLC unit with some kind of a compatible solvent as you're switching over. So something like 2-propanol or ethanol, making sure, of course, here that your column is completely removed at this point. So you're flushing everything really, really well with isopropanol or ethanol. And then before you even put the column on, flush the entire system with the column storage mobile phase, so hexane IPA. Again, you're just trying to make sure that there's no remaining forbidden solvents in that system before you go and you put your coated phase on there. Now, I mentioned the picture about the adsorbed samples. Here is what that would look like. So this was a semi-prep column. We took the inlet frit off. This CSP is supposed to be white. And this was a case where they were running some kind of a dirty sample through, and now the CSP is nice and brown as a result of whatever the sample components were adsorbing to the column. And so we took this column in-house, opened it up and saw this. And of course, what we would do in this case is likely repack the column with new CSP. And that is something I will discuss in the help section. Again, that's something that we can help you out with. So what happens after the retention or the selectivity changes have occurred? With the adsorbed samples, I mentioned the repack. That's something that we can help you with, repacking with new CSP. But like with the pressure issues and with the peak shape issues, sometimes you can regenerate the column or you can flush the column and actually save it. Really, it just depends on the sample. It depends on the individual case. For chemical attack, unfortunately, if you have degraded the silica or you have lost the polymer off the surface, you have to replace the column. There is no coming back from that, unfortunately. So again, that's why I harped on it as much as I possibly could. No forbidden solvents on your coated phases, and make sure that you're not using those harsh additives. So now that I've covered all of those major issues, hopefully I haven't scared you too much. The Chiral columns are quite robust, the mobilized phases as well as the coated phases, as long as you take care of them. It's no different than any other column. You want to protect your investment. But what happens if you need help from us? And these are things that we offer, extra services that we offer that might be able to save your column, add value to your column, and potentially extend the column life a little bit. So we do column hardware replacements. This is only for prep columns. As I said, with the analytical columns, typically we want to replace the column anyway because there's some other issues that are going on where it's really not feasible to just replace the inlet frit. But for column hardware replacement, we will open the column, we will replace the inlet frit, and we will ensure that the CSP is not damaged. That's extremely important, especially if you go over pressure, like I showed with the voids. Sometimes you will end up creating voids as a result of that. And if you do, then that is where the next two services come into play, either column reconditioning or column repacking. So if you did create a void in your column, we would actually go to the column repack then. We would go and we would remove any of the damaged CSP. We would add in new CSP up to the amount that it needs to be for a quality column. We'll repack it and QC it and send it back to you essentially as a brand new column. If you have some kind of an adsorbed sample on there, or there's some other chromatography issues that are going on, we can take it through our column regeneration process or recondition process. Very similar to repack, but we will take it through our regeneration sequence first, make sure that there isn't any analyte that's stuck on there that we can't help get off. And then again, if it needs to be repacked, we will take it into the next step then and do the repack. And one not necessarily related to a column that has died perhaps, or a column that needs some reworking, we can actually do column resizing. So we have a lot of cases where SFC, we see this a lot actually, folks have older 10 cm columns that perhaps they used for HPLC that are no longer applicable. We can actually take those larger columns in. We will resize them down to smaller usable columns for you, and we will send them back as in a size that you might be able to use now in your newer applications. And the point of all these really is they cost less than purchasing a new column. And like I said, it's added value to hopefully extend the column life a little bit longer to get more out of your initial investment. So the last couple things that I'll point out here are instruction manuals. A lot of what I talked about, especially with solvent compatibility, sample solvent compatibility, things like that, are all discussed in our instruction manuals. So we stopped sending them out with the columns, but we have them all available electronically online. So if you go to our homepage, chiraltech.com/USA, over to the right-hand side, you will see this quick links box, and there is an instruction manuals link, which will take you to all of the instruction manuals that we have for all of our CSPs. And if you can't find one on there, email us and we will send it to you. But in those instruction manuals, you will find some very useful information. This is a sample from our immobilized 3-micron stationary phases. You will find such things like operating instructions, the typical flow rates, and the recommended temperature ranges. You will also find suggested starting conditions for your screening. So these are your normal phase conditions here, your hexane IPA, hexane ethanol, and these are your extended range forbidden solvents that should never ever be used on your coated phases. So your MTBE, THF, and your DCM mobile phases. You will also find things like the suggested additives. I talked about these already, but other things for your basic additives like EDA or BA, and your acidic additives, as well as the suggested percentages that you should stay below. And then you'll also find some useful column care and maintenance, most of which I discussed earlier, but perhaps there's something additional that might help you in storing your columns and, again, protecting their lifetime. So in summary, the major causes of column failure can pretty much be summarized into 3 major points. These are the same for most chromatography columns, achiral, chiral, the same for HPLC columns as well as SFC columns. The major issues are column or inlet fouling. That can be avoided by the use of inline filters or guard columns, but without a doubt, making sure that you have good sample cleanup. Bed compression or void formation. So making sure that you are operating at low or at least reasonable flow rates as kind of outlined in the instruction manuals, and avoiding things like mechanical or thermal shock. And then lastly, chemical attack or modifications, whether it be memory effect or column history, or chemical attack as a result of using an inappropriate pH range, or the using of the restricted solvents on the coated phases. So those are the major points today. I will end here with a few email addresses for you that you might find interesting. questions@cti.dicel.com is where you can contact us if you have any general chromatography issues related to method development or anything related to this presentation today. Tracy Hartledge, who is the host for this webinar today, as well as myself, in case you have questions about this presentation or other chromatography or column questions. I also monitor the questions email address. So either way, I might end up answering your question for you. And then lastly, we have one more upcoming webinar this year on October 30th. The topic is to be determined at the moment, but we welcome your feedback as to potential subject matters on that. And with that, I will pass the mic back to Tracy. And I again thank you all for your attention today.
Thank you, Dr. Umstead, for a very informative presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'd like to also thank the technical support team for answering questions. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and please stay tuned for our next webinar coming in October. Bye-bye.